There are creatures born of the sea, and then there are creatures born of the imagination of the sea, shaped not by evolution, but by the deep and restless need of human beings to make sense of a world that refused to be understood. The ocean, for most of recorded history, was not a place. It was a condition, a vast, breathing uncertainty that swallowed ships and returned nothing. And into that uncertainty, the medieval mind poured everything it feared, everything it wondered, and everything it believed, until the water itself seemed to teem with meaning. Among all the strange things said to drift beneath those cold European waters, few were stranger or more enduring than the creature known as the Sea Bishop. W.C. picture it, as the scholars of the 15th and 16th centuries did, a being the size of a man, rising slowly from the deep, its body scaled like a fish, pale and glistening, its head bearing the unmistakable shape of a bishop's mitre, that tall, pointed, ceremonial hat worn by the princes of the Catholic Church, its arms, if you could call them that, ending in broad fins that folded like vestments, its face caught somewhere between human and something older, gazing back at the observer with an expression no one could quite name. It wore the sea the way a bishop wears a cathedral, as though the water were its jurisdiction. The earliest accounts of the Sea Bishop come to us from the mid-1500s, a period of extraordinary intellectual ferment, when Europe was simultaneously rediscovering the ancient world, tearing itself apart over religion, and beginning, cautiously, to sail to places it had never been before. The natural world was being catalogued with fresh urgency, and in the catalogues, alongside the wolf and the whale and the newly described creatures returning with explorers from distant shores, the Sea Bishop found its place. W. Watt. The most influential record appears in the work of the Swiss naturalist Conrad Gessner, whose monumental Historiae Animalium, published in the 1550s, attempted nothing less than a complete inventory of all living things known to man. Gessner was a serious scholar. He was also a man of his time, and his time did not yet draw a firm line between the witnessed and the imagined. Into his encyclopedia went the elephant and the rhinoceros alongside the manticore and the sea monk. And there, given the same weight as a sturgeon or a seal, went the Sea Bishop. The account he drew from, one of several circulating in manuscript, described a creature allegedly captured in the sea near Poland in the year 1531. It was brought, the story goes, before the King of Poland. It survived in captivity for 3 days. During those 3 days, it made signs, gestures, mute appeals, as if requesting to be returned to the sea. When granted its wish, it made the sign of the cross and disappeared beneath the water, never to be seen again. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Whether one believes that story matters far less than what it reveals. The Sea Bishop was not merely a monster to be feared, it was a symbol to be read, a message delivered in the language of the deep, Tebu. In a world where the church shaped the architecture of thought itself, where every stone, every star, every strangely formed root was understood as part of a divine conversation, a creature that wore the vestments of a bishop could not simply be a curiosity. It had to mean something. It had to be a sign, or a warning, or a wonder sent from God, to remind the faithful that his dominion did not stop at the shoreline. And so the Sea Bishop drifted through the centuries, through the woodcut illustrations of natural histories, through the margins of maps, through the letters of scholars writing to one another across the breadth of Europe. It was debated. It was interpreted. It was, by some, explained away, and by others, held up as proof of precisely the kind of miraculous order they had always believed the world to contain. This is the story of that creature, of how it was born, what it meant, who believed in it, and why. Centuries after the last person claimed to have seen one, it still speaks to something genuine in us, something that has never quite stopped listening for sounds from the deep. Come. The water is cold, and the light is low, and we have a long way to go. To understand how the sea bishop moved from whispered sailor's tale to printed, bound, and catalogued fact, you have to understand what was happening to knowledge itself in the 16th century, because something was happening to it, something profound and fast, and in many ways irreversible. The printing press had been in operation for roughly 100 years by the time the sea bishop began appearing in the major natural histories of Europe, and in those 100 years, the relationship between a story and its survival had changed entirely. Before Gutenberg, a claim about a strange creature from the sea might circulate through a monastery, drift into a traveler's journal, be copied by a bored scribe into a margin, and then simply stop, extinguished by geography and time. After the press, a claim could be set in type, called 1,000 times, bound in calfskin, and shipped to scholars in Zurich, Paris, Bologna, and London before the season turned. Ideas no longer needed legs. They had wheels. And so when the serious men of the 16th century, the naturalists, the physicians, the encyclopedists, sat down to document the world, they did so with a new and intoxicating sense of permanence. What they wrote would last. What they included would be consulted, cited, repeated. The responsibility was immense. And yet so was the appetite. Conrad Gessner was born in Zurich in 1506, the son of a furrier. He was, by any reckoning, one of the most astonishing minds of his century. He knew Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and several vernacular languages. He wrote on botany, medicine, linguistics, and mountaineering. He is sometimes called the father of alpine climbing, and he maintained a correspondence that stretched across the whole of educated Europe. He was also, by his own admission, a compiler as much as an observer. He gathered, he synthesized, he trusted with careful discrimination the reports of others. His Historiae Animalium, the great work of his life, runs to thousands of pages across multiple volumes published through the 1550s. It is a world made of words and woodcuts, every animal described, illustrated where possible, situated within the web of everything written about it before. Aristotle appears, Pliny appears, Arabic scholars appear, and alongside them, with the same scholarly apparatus of citation and cross-reference, appear the creatures that later centuries would call mythological. Gessner was not naive. He flagged uncertainty. He noted when accounts conflicted. He was, within the limits of his epistemology, a rigorous man. But his epistemology, the framework of what counted as reliable knowledge, was not ours. Eyewitness testimony from a respected source was evidence. A detailed and internally consistent account was evidence. The fact that a story had circulated for years without being definitively disproved was, in its way, evidence. The sea bishop, by these standards, had earned its place on the page. The account Gessner drew upon most heavily came from a Polish source, and here we encounter one of the great pleasures and frustrations of historical research, which is that the further back you go, the more the original sources blur into one another like reflections in moving water. What we know is this: a creature described as a sea bishop was reportedly caught off the coast of Poland in the Baltic around the year 1531. The account of its capture was written up, passed along through correspondences and manuscript copies, and eventually reached Gessner and his contemporaries. The creature was described as being roughly man-sized. Its head bore the shape of a bishop's mitre. Its body was covered in scales. It had what were described as fins in place of hands, and a fish's tail in place of legs. It was brought before King Sigismund I of Poland, who reportedly kept it at court for several days, and then, and this is the detail that made the story live, the bishops of Poland were consulted. The creature, it was said, gestured toward these bishops with what seemed like recognition, with what seemed, to those watching, like supplication. It asked, through signs, through mime, through something that the observers could only interpret as communication, to be released. The bishops interceded with the king. The king relented. The creature was carried back to the sea. It turned before submerging. It made the sign of the cross, and it was gone. This story is not simply a monster story. Read it again slowly, and you will notice what it is doing. It is a story about hierarchy, divine hierarchy, made visible in flesh. A creature that recognized bishops. That appealed to them. That, upon receiving mercy, responded with the most sacred gesture of the Christian faith. This was not chaos from the deep. This was order from the deep. This was the ocean itself confirming the structure of the church. Guillaume Rondelet was a Frenchman, born in Montpellier in 1507, and he approached the natural world from the perspective of a physician and an ichthyologist, a student of fish. His great work, Libri de Piscibus Marinis, published in 1554 and 1555, was among the most careful and detailed studies of marine life produced in the 16th century. Where Gesner was a synthesizer, Rondelet was something closer to a field observer. He dissected, he compared, he traveled to coastal markets and fishing villages and examined what the nets brought in. And yet Rondelet, too, included the sea bishop. His illustration differs from Gesner's. The creature in Rondelet's woodcut is more overtly humanoid, its face more expressive, its mitre-shaped head more pronounced. Rondelet places it among the rays and the sharks and the creatures he personally examined, without apology and without excessive qualification. It belongs to the sea. The sea produces wonders. Here is one of them. What is remarkable about Rondelet's treatment is what it tells us about the intellectual atmosphere of the time. This was not a man prone to credulity. His work on actual fish, on the anatomy of rays, on the classification of eels, is careful and often accurate by modern standards. And yet the category of the marvelous was not, for him, incompatible with the category of the real. The world was large. It was largely uncharted. The sea in particular held depths that no one had sounded. What principle exactly would prevent it from containing a creature shaped like a bishop? Top sea. There is another scholar worth pausing on here, less famous than Gesner or Rondelet, but crucial to understanding how the sea bishop traveled through time. Pierre Pommer, a French pharmacist and naturalist, writing at the very end of the 17th century, included the creature in his Histoire générale des drogues, a general history of natural substances used in medicine. By Pommer's time, the intellectual world had shifted considerably. The Royal Society in London had been founded, the microscope was in use. Experiment was beginning to challenge testimony as the gold standard of knowledge. And yet there was Pommer, still including the sea bishop, now with a note of greater distance, a slightly more cautious framing, but including it nonetheless, because the books that had included it before were still on the shelves. The citations were still there. The printed word had given the creature a kind of immortality that mere skepticism could not quickly undo. This is one of the strangest gifts the printing press gave to the mythological world. It did not just spread stories, it anchored them. It gave them an address. You could go to a library, pull a volume from a shelf, and point to the sea bishop on the page, illustrated, described, cited, cross-referenced. It had provenance, it had footnotes, and footnotes, even in the 16th century, carried a kind of authority that a fireside tale never could. TBU. By the time the sea bishop had passed through the hands of Gesner and Rondelet and their contemporaries, it had become something more than a rumor. It had become part of the official record of the natural world, a record that was, at that moment in history, being written for the first time with any real ambition toward completeness. To be in that record was to exist, in the most durable sense available to the 16th century. The creature would not be easily dislodged, not yet. There was still a great deal of world left to believe in, and as we will see, the sea bishop's story was only beginning to deepen, because the question of what it actually was, beneath the vestments and the legend, was one that would occupy careful minds for generations. The ocean, it turned out, had answers. They simply were not the answers anyone expected. To understand how the sea bishop moved from whispered sailor's tale to printed, bound, and catalogued fact, you have to understand what was happening to knowledge itself in the 16th century. Because something was happening to it, something profound and fast, and in many ways irreversible. There is a way of seeing the world that has become so foreign to the modern mind that it requires a certain patience to enter, a willingness to set down, for a moment, everything we think we know about how nature works, and to stand instead inside a universe that is not governed by physics, but by meaning. This was the universe the sea bishop inhabited, and until we understand it, the creature will always seem like nothing more than a quaint error, a mistake made by people who simply didn't know better. But that reading is too easy, and too unkind. The people who wrote about the sea bishop were not stupid. They were operating within a cosmology of breathtaking internal coherence, and within that cosmology, a fish shaped like a bishop was not merely possible. It was, in a very real sense, expected. Begin with the structure of the medieval and early modern cosmos, because it is the architecture that makes everything else legible. The universe, as understood through the long synthesis of Aristotle, Plato, and Christian theology, was not a random collection of matter moving through empty space. It was a hierarchy, a great chain. Scholars called it the Scala Naturae, the ladder of nature, stretching from God at its summit, through the angels, through humanity, through the animals, the plants, the stones, and down into the formless void at its base. Everything had a rung. Everything had a place. And the whole arrangement was not merely descriptive, it was normative. Things belonged where they were. The hierarchy was not a classification system invented by human beings to organize their observations. It was the actual structure of reality, built into creation by a God who was, above all things, orderly. Within this framework, the natural world was not simply a collection of organisms competing for survival. It was a text, a language. Every creature was a word in a divine sentence, and the task of the naturalist, the task of the theologian, the physician, the scholar, was to read it, to understand not just what a thing was, but what it meant, what it pointed toward, what it said about the mind of the Creator who had made it. This way of reading nature had a name. It was called the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God had written meaning into the surface of things, that the appearance of a plant or creature revealed its purpose, its character, its place in the order of things. A plant with heart-shaped leaves might heal the heart. A stone the color of blood might staunch bleeding, and a creature that wore the vestments of a bishop, that rose from the sea bearing the unmistakable silhouette of ecclesiastical authority, could not possibly be wearing that shape by accident. Al-Seben. To feel the full weight of this, you have to understand what a bishop was in the world the sea bishop appeared in. Not simply an administrator, not simply a senior clergyman in an institutional hierarchy. A bishop, in the Catholic understanding, was something altogether more charged. He was an apostolic successor, a man in whom the authority of Christ's own disciples lived on, passed down through an unbroken chain of consecration stretching back to the earliest church. He was, in a specific and theologically serious sense, a living link between the human and the divine. The mitre he wore, that tall, pointed, cleft crown, was not decorative. It symbolized the tongues of flame that had descended upon the apostles at Pentecost. It was a garment of the Holy Spirit. When the observer in Poland, or wherever the original sighting truly occurred, looked at a creature rising from the water with that shape upon its head, they were not seeing a funny hat. They were seeing a symbol loaded with centuries of theological meaning, emerging from the most mysterious and ungovernable element in the known world. The sea, in the biblical imagination, was the place that resisted God's order most stubbornly. In Genesis, creation begins as God moves across the face of the waters. The deep, formless void, chaos itself. The sea in the Psalms is where the great monsters live. It is the place that must be commanded to be still. And yet here, rising from that very chaos, was a creature that wore the sign of divine authority upon its brow. The ocean, it seemed, had its own bishop, its own representative of the heavenly order, its own confirmation that God's hierarchy extended to the lightless floor of the deep. The sea worse. It is worth pausing here to consider the emotional texture of this idea, because it was not, primarily, a frightening one. The sea was frightening. The creatures said to inhabit the deeper waters were, by and large, terrifying. Enormous serpents, swallowing whales, things with too many arms, and not enough discernible intention. Against that backdrop of oceanic dread, the sea bishop offered something rather different. It offered reassurance. If even the sea had its bishop, if even the fathomless dark was not beyond the reach of holy order, then the cosmos was still intact. The hierarchy still held. God was still in his heaven, and his authority still descended, rung by rung, all the way down through the water column, to whatever lived in the silt at the bottom of things. The sea bishop was not a monster to be slain. It was a sign to be read, and the sign said, "Do not be afraid. The order holds." This is why the story of the Polish bishop appealed so deeply and persisted so long. The creature had not just appeared. It had behaved. It had recognized the bishops. It had appealed to them. It had, upon receiving grace and mercy, responded with the sign of the cross, the most compressed and potent symbol of Christian theology. The story was not a report of a natural curiosity. It was a parable, a demonstration in living flesh of the truths the Church had always preached: mercy, hierarchy, grace, the cross. Even the sea could not escape the sermon. Bye. There is a related tradition worth drawing into the light here, because it runs alongside the sea bishop like a shadow and illuminates it from a slightly different angle. Medieval and early modern bestiaries, those illustrated catalogues of animals, real and imagined, that were among the most widely copied books of the Middle Ages, were not primarily scientific documents. They were moral ones. Every animal in a bestiary existed to teach a lesson. The pelican, which was said to feed its young with blood from its own breast, was Christ. The phoenix, rising from its ashes, was the resurrection. The unicorn, which could only be tamed by a virgin, was the incarnation. Into this tradition, the sea bishop fits with a naturalness that, once you see it, seems almost inevitable. It was the ocean's contribution to the great moral catalogue, a creature whose very body was a lesson about the reach of divine order, about the universality of the Church's authority, about the correspondence between the visible world and the invisible truths. It was always, in the medieval understanding, pointing toward. The sea had its monks too. The sea monk was a related creature, described in the same natural histories, similarly vestmented, similarly interpreted. Together, the sea bishop and the sea monk formed a kind of underwater clergy, a ghostly echo of the institutional Church, refracted through cold water and deep imagination. The ocean, in this reading, was not godless. It was simply a parish no one had managed to visit. Not all at once. The history of ideas never moves all at once, but in ways that would eventually make the sea bishop's theological logic harder to sustain. The Reformation tore through the unity of the Western Church in the early 16th century, right at the moment the creature was entering the natural histories. The authority of bishops, quite suddenly, was not something every European agreed upon. The hierarchy that had seemed as natural as gravity was revealed to be, at least in part, a human construction. One that could be questioned, challenged, and for vast numbers of people in Northern Europe, rejected entirely. In that newly fractured world, a creature whose entire significance depended on the unquestioned sacredness of bishops was going to mean something different, depending on where you stood. For a Catholic naturalist, the sea bishop was still a marvel of divine order. For a Protestant one, it may have carried a whiff of the absurd, or worse, of papist credulity. The kind of thing credulous Southerners believed because their bishops told them to. The creature had been born in a unified Christendom. It would live out most of its life in a divided one, and that division, quiet as it was already beginning to erode the ground beneath its fins. But the sea bishop was not finished yet, not by a long way, because, just as the theological world that had cradled it began to shift, a new kind of curiosity was rising, one that would look at the creature not as a symbol, not as a sermon, but as a specimen. And that gaze, cold and clinical as it was, would produce one of the strangest and most poignant chapters in the whole long story of this impossible thing. The scientists were coming, and they had questions the bishops could not answer. There is a particular kind of intellectual courage required to look at something everyone around you accepts as true, and to ask, quietly, carefully, without drama, whether it might instead be something else entirely. Not nothing, not a fabrication, but something else, something real and explicable, and perhaps even more interesting for being so. This is the courage that began to stir in the minds of European naturalists as the 17th century gathered itself. A slow, patient willingness to put the creature back into the water, so to speak, and ask what it actually was. Not what it meant, not what God intended by it, but what, precisely, a fisherman or a sailor might have seen, or touched, or pulled from a net that could have given rise, through the alchemy of awe, distance, and retelling, to something as elaborate and vestmented as the sea bishop. The question sounds simple. The answer, it turned out, was anything but. To begin with the problem of the ocean itself, which in the 16th and 17th centuries was still, in practical terms, nearly as mysterious as it had ever been. Ships crossed it. Fishermen worked its edges. But the systematic study of what lived beneath the surface, the discipline we now call marine biology, was, in any recognizable form, centuries away. The creatures that came up in nets were identified by fishermen who cared primarily about whether they were edible, and by scholars who had access to those fishermen's reports, but rarely to the creatures themselves. What this meant, in practice, was that the identification of marine animals in the early modern period was a deeply uncertain business. A creature pulled from the deep water, dead and decomposing by the time it reached shore, distorted by the transition from pressure to surface, perhaps damaged by the net or by the hands of men who had never seen anything like it. This was the raw material from which natural history had to work. The gap between the thing itself and the description of the thing was wide, and in that gap, imagination was not an intruder. It was a necessity. It is in this context that the most compelling rational explanations for the sea bishop begin to take shape. And there are several. Each is plausible. Each tells us something. And taken together, they sketch the outline of a real creature, or a handful of real creatures. That may have been the biological seed from which the legend grew. The most widely favored candidate, among the scholars who have examined the question seriously, is the angel shark. Known to science as Squatina squatina, the angel shark is a flattened, bottom-dwelling species that was once common throughout the shallow coastal waters of Europe, including the Baltic and the North Sea, precisely the waters from which the sea bishop accounts most often emerge. It is a strange-looking animal by any reckoning. Its body is broad and compressed, more ray-like than shark-like at first glance. Its pectoral fins, splayed wide, give it a faintly winged, almost caped appearance when seen from above. And its head, blunt, wide, with a certain squareness to the snout, can, in the right light, at the right angle, by the right observer, suggest something vaguely anthropomorphic. The angel shark has been fished from European waters for centuries. It was well known to coastal communities, and a large specimen. They can reach 2.5 meters, hauled onto a deck, still moving, water streaming from its wide, flat body, seen by men who had grown up with the stories of sea monks and sea bishops already lodged in their imaginations, might very plausibly have become, in the telling, something far more portentous than a large and unfamiliar shark. The mind, after all, does not see neutrally. It sees through the lens of what it already knows and already expects. Show a 16th century sailor something he has no category for, and he will reach for the nearest category available. If the nearest available category is a creature from the deep that wears the vestments of a bishop, if that is the shape the culture has already prepared him to see, then that is, very possibly, what he will report having seen. A second candidate is the Atlantic wolfish, Anarichaus lupus, a deep water species with a large, broad head, powerful jaws, and a long, tapering body. The wolfish is an unsettling animal to encounter. Its face, dominated by prominent teeth and a wide, somewhat mournful expression, has a quality that observers have frequently described as disturbingly human. Its head, seen in isolation, is broad across the top and narrower below, a profile that, to a sufficiently primed eye, might recall the flared sides of a mitre. The wolfish is also found in the cold northern waters of the Atlantic and the Baltic, making it geographically plausible as a source for the accounts. But the candidate that has attracted perhaps the most scholarly attention, and which carries, in this writer's view, the most quietly poetic resonance, is the walrus. The walrus. Consider it for a moment. A creature of immense bulk, far larger than any human being, with a face of remarkable and unexpected expressiveness. Its eyes are small and deep-set, giving it an air of heavy, mournful thoughtfulness. Its great tusks curve downward like ceremonial ornaments. Its skin hangs in loose, wrinkled folds that suggest, faintly, the draping of heavy robes. And when a walrus hauls itself from the water onto a rock, when it raises its massive, whisked head and turns to look at you with those dark, considering eyes, there is a quality to the encounter that is genuinely difficult to describe. It is not quite like looking at a fish. It is not quite like looking at a mammal. It is, in some register that precedes rational analysis, like looking at something that has opinions. Walruses were not well known to most of southern and central Europe in the 16th century. They were creatures of the far north, the Arctic seas, the coasts of Scandinavia and Russia, encountered by Norse sailors and Russian fishermen, but only beginning to filter into the awareness of the educated European South through travelers' reports and the occasional specimen brought back as a curiosity. A walrus, described at second or third hand by someone who had seen one at distance, in poor light, heaving itself from cold water. The description that reached the scholar's desk might be almost unrecognizable. Several historians of natural history have noted that the proportions described in some sea bishop accounts, the broad, heavy body, the suggestion of vestmental drapery, the large and curiously expressive head, match the walrus more closely than any fish. And there is something deeply satisfying about this possibility. The walrus is, in its own right, one of the most extraordinary animals on Earth. It needed no embellishment, but embellishment came anyway, because the world the observers inhabited demanded that extraordinary things be made to mean something beyond their mere existence. IL. There is one more candidate worth considering, and it is the strangest of all. Strange not because the animal is unusual, but because of what its identification implies about the process by which legends are made. Some scholars have suggested that at least some sea bishop sightings may have been encounters with the common skate, or with large rays, broad, flat, cartilaginous fish that, when seen from below the surface by someone leaning over the side of a boat, or when partially beached and viewed from an angle, present a body outline that is genuinely puzzling. The wing-like pectoral fins extend like arms or robes. The underside of a skate, with its two small nostrils and slot-like mouth arranged in an arrangement that is anatomically facial, has been noted by observers across centuries as having an unsettling resemblance to a human face, and the claspers of a male's skate. The paired reproductive appendages visible on the underside have, in recorded history, been mistaken more than once for legs. A large skate, seen at the wrong angle, by the right person at the right moment of expectation and fear, could become almost anything the viewer needed it to be. To what is striking, sitting with all of these candidates together, is not that any one of them is the definitive answer. It almost certainly isn't that simple, but that the sea bishop legend was capacious enough to absorb impressions from many different real animals, many different real encounters, and weave them into a single coherent mythology. The legend was not built from one sighting. It was built from dozens of moments of genuine confusion and genuine wonder, all of them finding the same pre-existing shape, waiting to receive them. This is how myths of natural history tend to work. They are not inventions exactly. They are accumulations, sediment laid down by many currents, over many years, until something solid forms that no single current could have produced alone. And what the early rationalists, the men who first began to ask these questions seriously, discovered, when they started to look carefully, was not that the sea bishop was a lie. It was that it was a kind of truth, a compressed and costumed summary of genuine encounters with genuinely mysterious things. The ocean really did contain wonders. It still does. The mistake was not in believing that. The mistake was only in the vestments. But stripping away the vestments, it turned out, was harder than it looked, because by the time the rational explanations began to circulate, the sea bishop had been in print for over a century. It had accumulated citations, the way a ship accumulates barnacles, slowly, steadily, until the original hull was almost invisible beneath the weight of everything attached to it. And in the popular imagination, in the woodcuts pinned to tavern walls, in the stories told by fishermen to their children on winter evenings, in the margins of maps that sailors carried across the water, the creature swam on, unhurried and untroubled, wearing its mitre with the quiet authority of something that has never once been asked to prove itself. The scientists had their explanations. The legend had something better. It had staying power. And, as we will see in the chapter that follows, the way the sea bishop survived, the manner of its persistence through the long, slow death of the world that had made it, is perhaps the most human part of this whole inhuman story. Myths do not die the way living things die. There is no moment of cessation, no clear border between before and after. They thin instead. They become translucent. They are repeated with less conviction, included with more apology, until one day you realize that the thing you are looking at is no longer believed. It is merely remembered, and even that remembering carries its own kind of life, quieter than the original, but in some ways more durable. The sea bishop's decline was exactly this kind of thinning. It did not disappear from the page overnight. It retreated slowly, across roughly a century and a half, from the status of natural fact to the status of charming error. From a creature filed alongside the shark and the whale, to a creature filed alongside the mistake, and tracing the precise path of that retreat tells us something important, not just about the sea bishop, but about the way the educated European mind learned, painfully and incompletely, to distinguish between what it had observed and what it had imagined. All quiet. The 17th century is where the first serious cracks appear, not in popular culture. The woodcuts and the chapbooks and the fireside stories would carry the creature much further, well into the 18th century and beyond. But in the writing of the serious naturalists, the ones who understood themselves to be doing something methodologically new, a new tone begins to creep in, a note of hesitation, of qualification, of the slight discomfort a careful person feels when they must include something they are no longer entirely sure of, but cannot yet responsibly exclude. John Johnston, a Scottish-Polish physician and naturalist writing in the mid-17th century, included the sea bishop in his Historiae Naturalis, published in the 1650s. Johnston was, in many respects, a transitional figure, a man with one foot in the Gessner tradition of comprehensive encyclopedism, and one foot in the emerging culture of empirical skepticism. His natural history is a fascinating document precisely because you can feel him navigating this tension in real time. He reproduces the sea bishop, he reproduces the illustration, he cites his predecessors, and then, almost imperceptibly, he steps back a fraction. He does not endorse the creature with quite the same confidence his sources had. He reports. He does not quite assert. It is a small difference in tone. But tone is where belief lives, and its shifting is everything. The instrument that did the most damage to the sea bishop and to the entire population of marvelous creatures that had shared its shelf space in the natural histories was not any single argument or discovery. It was a change in the standard of evidence itself, and that change had a name, even if it was never stated quite so boldly in the documents of the time. The name was Show Me. The Royal Society, founded in London in 1660, placed at the center of its program the idea that natural knowledge must be grounded in repeatable, verifiable, preferably witnessed experiment, not in the authority of ancient texts, not in the internal coherence of a theological system, not in the testimony of a correspondent who had heard from a fisherman who had been told by a sailor, in demonstration, in the thing itself, present and observable, available to more than one pair of eyes. This was, in the deepest sense, a revolution, not in what was known, but in what could count as knowing. And under its new dispensation, the sea bishop had a problem. No one had one. No one could produce one. The accounts, examined with the new cold eye of empirical scrutiny, collapsed into a chain of citations that led back, always, to the same handful of sources that themselves led back to accounts at second and third hand, to stories heard from sailors, to descriptions of creatures seen once and never again, in waters far away, in circumstances that could not be replicated or confirmed. The creature had flourished in a world where the chain of testimony was itself a form of proof. It could not flourish in a world that asked for something harder than testimony. And so, volume by volume, edition by edition, it began its long migration out of the serious literature and into something else, something less authoritative and considerably more interesting. By what it migrated into was art and folklore, and the illustrated margins of a culture that was rapidly modernizing its official knowledge while quietly, stubbornly retaining its appetite for the marvelous. The 18th century is full of the sea bishop, if you know where to look. It appears in popular illustrated broadsides, the cheap printed sheets sold in markets and pinned to walls, where it has shed its scholarly apparatus entirely and become pure spectacle, pure wonder. It appears in the decorative cartouches of maps, where cartographers who no longer believed in sea monsters continued to draw them anyway, because a map without a sea monster in its ocean was a map that felt somehow impoverished. It appears in the collections of curiosities that wealthy Europeans assembled in their homes, the Wunderkammern, the cabinets of wonder, where fabricated specimens, constructed by skilled and unscrupulous craftsmen from the bodies of real animals, were displayed alongside genuine rarities and marvels as proof of their collectors' access to the extraordinary. This last point deserves a moment of attention because it represents one of the stranger chapters in the creature's biography. There is good historical evidence that fake sea creatures, composite fabrications assembled from the bodies of rays, monkeys, fish, and other materials, were produced and sold throughout the early modern period to satisfy the enormous demand for natural wonders. The most famous example is the so-called Fiji mermaid, which P.T. Barnum would display in the 19th century, but the tradition is much older. Skillful craftsmen could produce objects that were genuinely difficult to explain, that seemed to confirm the existence of creatures from the depths, and that commanded extraordinary prices from collectors eager to possess a piece of the marvelous. Whether any such fabricated sea bishop ever existed, any constructed object designed to represent the creature in 3 dimensions, is not definitively established. But the culture that produced the Fiji mermaid was the same culture that had been circulating sea bishop illustrations for 2 centuries. The demand and the supply were made for one another. Meanwhile, in the fishing communities and coastal villages of northern Europe, in the Baltic ports, the Norwegian fishing settlements, the remote islands of Scotland and the Faroes, the creature lived on in a different register entirely, not as a subject of natural history, and not as a cabinet curiosity, but as part of the texture of local knowledge about the sea. The oral traditions of maritime communities are among the most conservative in existence. They preserve, sometimes for centuries, the sediment of older beliefs that the literate culture has long since discarded, but that the community retains in modified form because they continue to serve some psychological or social purpose. In these traditions, the sea bishop is not always called by that name. It blurs into the broader category of the seaman, the merman, the finfolk, humanoid creatures of the deep that watch the fishermen from below, that occasionally surface, that occasionally communicate, that are neither quite friendly nor quite hostile, but exist in some charged middle space between the human world and the oceanic one. The theological costuming falls away. What remains is the core of the idea that the sea contains something like us, that we are not alone in the water, that the deep is inhabited by intelligence, or something close enough to intelligence that the distinction becomes, on a dark night far from shore, purely academic. This is perhaps the oldest part of the sea bishop. Older than the Mitra, older than the natural histories, older than Conrad Gessner and Guillaume Rondelet and the Polish court. The figure of the humanoid sea creature reaches back through human history further than any text can follow, into the Babylonian god, Oannes, who rose from the Persian Gulf each day to teach humanity the arts of civilization, and descended again each night into the deep, into the fish-tailed deities of Phoenicia and Canaan, into the sirens and tritons of Greece. The sea bishop, in this long view, was not a new creature at all. It was an ancient archetype wearing new clothes borrowed from the most visible institution of its particular historical moment. Ta. By the 19th century, the creature had completed its transition. In the formal scientific literature, it was gone, extinct, not in the biological sense, but in the epistemological one. The new natural histories did not include it, except occasionally in historical footnotes, where it appeared as an example of pre-scientific credulity, a relic of the time before method. This is the fate of most mythological creatures. When science finally closes its account with them, they become evidence of human error rather than human wonder. Cautionary tales about the dangers of believing what you cannot prove. But the sea bishop escaped the worst of that condescension, perhaps because its story was always slightly too interesting to be reduced to mere mistake. the historians of science who began in the 19th and 20th centuries to examine the natural history tradition seriously, to read Gessner not as a fool but as a man of his time, doing something genuinely difficult, found in the sea bishop a creature worth understanding on its own terms, worth asking patiently and without mockery what it had meant, and how it had worked, and what it told us about the long, slow, uneven process by which humanity learned to separate the ocean's actual wonders from the wonders it had projected onto the deep. That process, it turns out, is still going. The ocean remains, even now, the least known environment on Earth. More of the lunar surface has been mapped than the seafloor. The deep water still returns creatures that astonish. The giant squid, the barrel-eye fish, the frilled shark that looks precisely like something a medieval naturalist would have invented. And each new discovery is a reminder that the impulse which produced the sea bishop was not, at its root, irrational. It was simply early. It was humanity reaching, with the tools available to it, toward a truth it could sense but not yet see. The sea is vast, and it is dark, and it is full of things we do not yet have names for. The people of the 16th century knew this as surely as we do. They simply dressed the knowledge differently. The mitre was wrong. The wonder was not. There is a particular quality to the light on the Baltic Sea in early autumn. The sky comes low and grey, and the water beneath it takes on a colour that has no precise name in English. Something between pewter and slate, something that shifts as you look at it, never quite settling. The fishing boats that still work those waters move through it slowly, their engines low, their crews quiet in the particular way that people are quiet when they are very far from shore, and the horizon has closed around them on all sides. Stand at the rail of such a boat, in such light, and look down into the water. You will not see far. A meter, perhaps two, before the dark closes in and the depth becomes simply depth. Fathomless, opaque, containing whatever it contains without any obligation to show you. And something in you, something older than your education and your rationalism and everything you have been taught to believe about the natural world, will wonder, will feel, however briefly, the pull of the ancient question, the one that has been asked from every shore since human beings first stood at the edge of the sea and understood that they could not follow it down. What is in there? This is where the sea bishop lives now. Not in the natural histories. Those shelves were cleared long ago. Not in the theological cosmologies. Those were dismantled brick by careful brick over the 4 centuries since the creature first appeared in print. It lives in that question, in the space between the surface and the dark, in the part of the human mind that the Enlightenment trained and disciplined and made immeasurably more capable, but could never quite bring itself to extinguish entirely. We have traveled a considerable distance together in this documentary, from the first whispered accounts of something strange off the Polish coast, through the candlelit studies of the great encyclopedists, through the theological architecture that gave the creature its meaning, through the slow and patient work of the rationalists who began to ask what it really was, and through the long twilight in which the legend thinned and faded from the official record while quietly persisting everywhere else. What I would like to do now, in these final pages, is not to summarize that journey. You have made it yourself, and summaries are poor things, but to sit with what it means, to ask what the story of the sea bishop, taken as a whole, tells us about the people who told it, and, perhaps more uncomfortably, what it tells us about ourselves. The easiest reading of the sea bishop's story is the one that positions us on the winning side of history. We know better now. We have microscopes and sonar and submersibles that have visited the deepest trenches on Earth and returned with footage. We have the angel shark and the walrus and the giant squid, all the real wonders that the real ocean contains, documented, measured, understood. We do not need the sea bishop because we have something better. We have actual knowledge of actual things. This reading is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, And its incompleteness matters because it leaves out the part of the story that is most worth keeping. The people who wrote about the sea bishop were not, in the main, foolish people. Conrad Gessner was one of the most learned men of the 16th century. Guillaume Rondelet produced work on actual marine anatomy that remained authoritative for generations. The theologians and physicians and scholars who consulted the creature's image and drew conclusions from it were, by the standards available to them, doing something entirely reasonable. They were reading the world with the tools they had. They were making sense of genuinely confusing sensory experience using the frameworks their culture had given them. The frameworks were wrong about the sea bishop. They were not wrong about everything. The impulse behind them, the conviction that the world is not random, that it has structure and pattern and meaning, that the strange things encountered at the edges of the known deserve careful attention rather than dismissal. That impulse is not wrong at all. It is, in fact, the same impulse that drives science. The difference is not in the desire to understand, it is only in the method, to I am. There is something else worth sitting with, and it is this. The sea bishop was, among other things, an expression of longing. A longing for the world to be ordered, for the hierarchy of meaning to hold, for God's dominion to extend even to the places that felt most beyond human reach, in the cold northern waters, in the dark and the depth and the storm. The creature offered something that purely rational knowledge has never quite managed to offer with the same emotional force. It offered the sense that someone was in charge down there, that the deep was not simply indifferent, that even the ocean had its bishop, its representative of the higher order, its living proof that the cosmos was a unified thing in which no part was truly abandoned to chaos. We do not believe that anymore, most of us. The ocean, we understand now, is indifferent. It has no bishop. It is governed by physics and chemistry and the long, blind logic of evolution, none of which was put there by anyone, none of which cares whether we drown. This knowledge is true, and it is, in its way, one of the loneliest pieces of knowledge our civilization has produced. The sea bishop was a comfort, not a false one, or not entirely, because the longing it answered was real, the need to feel that the world makes sense, that it holds together, that the darkness at the edge of things is not simply emptiness. These are not intellectual errors. They are among the most persistently human things there are. And when we look at the woodcut of the creature in Gessner's pages, standing in its scales and its mitre, with its finned hands folded and its flat fish face turned toward us, what we are looking at is not stupidity. We're looking at need. Ancient, dignified, entirely recognizable need. The sea bishop also tells us something about the nature of images, about the extraordinary power of a picture to make a thing real. The woodcuts that illustrated Gessner and Rondelet were not photographs. They were interpretations, built from verbal descriptions, passed through the hands of artists who had never seen the thing they were drawing and who worked, inevitably, from the shapes already present in their visual vocabulary. A bishop's mitre was a shape they knew. A fish was a shape they knew. Put them together, and you have something that looks, on the page, entirely credible, entirely specific, entirely present. And once it was present on the page, it was real in the way that things on pages are real, more real in some respects than things that exist only in the air and the memory. You could point to it, you could copy it, you could cite it. The image made the creature durable in a way that testimony alone never could. And the creature's durability then became its own form of evidence. It had been illustrated in the most authoritative natural histories of the century. Surely that meant something. We are not immune to this logic. We live in an era of images, far more saturated and immediate than anything the 16th century could have imagined. And we know, or we tell ourselves we know, that an image is not proof of anything, and yet the image still moves us. The picture still lands differently than the word. The brain still responds to the visual with a conviction it does not always extend to the merely described. The sea bishop exploited this without any intention to exploit. It simply existed in a form the eye found persuasive, and the eye did the rest. Number W. Lublians, Dublians, 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 Dublians. The sea bishop exploited. Minus Dublians, Dublians, to the Baltic in autumn, and the fishing boats, and the particular quality of light that falls on that sea when the season is turning, and the sky and the surface have become almost the same color, so that the horizon disappears and you are left with the sensation of floating inside something rather than upon it. Somewhere in these waters, or in waters very like them, the story began. A fisherman, or a sailor, or a man on a dock in a port city whose name we do not know, saw something he could not name, something large and strange and briefly present before the water closed over it again. He told someone. That someone told someone else. The story accumulated detail the way a river accumulates silt, slowly, without design, each retelling adding something and subtracting something, until the creature that arrived, years later, on the desk of a Swiss naturalist in Zurich, bore only a faint resemblance to whatever had actually broken the surface that day. But it bore a very precise resemblance to what the age needed to believe was in the water. And that, in the end, is the most honest thing you can say about the sea bishop. It was true in the way that all the deepest myths are true, not literally, not factually, but in the way that reveals something real about the people who needed it, the world that produced it, and the darkness that inspired it. The creature made the sign of the cross and went back into the sea. It took with it everything it knew, and the water closed over it, the way water always does, as though it had never been there at all. But we are still here, still at the rail, still looking down into the dark, where the light gives out and the depth begins. Still, in some register below the rational, waiting for something to rise. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that waiting is itself the thing, the oldest and most human thing. The sea bishop taught us that much, if nothing else. It taught us that the ocean does not have to give us its secrets for us to stand at its edge and feel, with complete and overwhelming certainty, that it has them. It always has.